Sony have just sent me this box. I know what this is. Sony have already told me what's going on. Let's have a look. We've got the 200 to 600mm lens. Very nice, but it's not why we're here. What is this, the 85mm G Master? Yep, it certainly is. One of my favorite portrait lenses of all time. This is why we're here, and this is super exciting. This is the A7 IV, the Sony A7 IV, and on paper, this is definitely everything I wanted from an upgrade to one of my favorite cameras of all time, the A7 III. This immediately feels very good. I don't think it's got a battery. Oh, it has. That is lightweight then. So it's an updated grip, which is very comfortable. The buttons feel quite a lot like the A7R IV, where they're kind of raised, you know, they're very tactile. I've got a flip out screen now. Yes, love that. I'm gonna pop some lenses on this. I'm gonna go out and do a load of stuff. I'm gonna do a load of photos, a load of video, of course, a bit like the A7 III. This is a great hybrid camera. This is a great system to go and shoot all kinds of stuff on. We're gonna do that. We're gonna test it out. I've got it for about 48 hours. Let's go try this out. Ooh, okay. Let's talk about the A7 IV. So I've had it for about 48 hours. I've shot all kinds of different stuff with it, photo, video, just like the A7 III. This is definitely a hybrid camera, you know, designed for photographers, videographers, and of course, hybrid shooters. It's the basic model in the range. That's what Sony is saying. I think that's pretty unfair. I guess I get why Sony call it the basic model. The A7R IV is obviously a high resolution photography camera, A7S III, super pro video camera. The A9 II is your kind of speedy wildlife sports camera. You got the A1, which kind of does everything extremely well. It's your one camera you need. And then this one is an all-rounder, but I guess compared to the A1, it's the kind of basic version of an all-rounder. But the thing about the A7 IV is it's super exciting because it's the accessible model, right? The price point, the kind of point that it sits at in the market makes this really interesting because, like I say, it's the accessible ones, the one that is actually going to be super popular. It's kind of for everyone, enthusiasts, but also professional photographers and professional videographers. You know, I did loads of work with the A7 III for clients. I never had any problems with that. And let me tell you, I would absolutely do stuff with the A7 IV, 100%. So let's dive into it. Let's stop talking about all that nonsense. Let's talk about some of the stuff with this camera. Let's start off with image quality. We're going to talk about photography first before we dive into video. There's going to be chapters down here in the bar, so you can skip around if you want to see something specific. Otherwise, join me on this journey of talking about the A7 IV. 33 megapixels, that's the initial thing I want to throw out there. That's a really good resolution because it's not too high. You know, file size isn't going to be ridiculous and it doesn't cut into things like, you know, the A1 has a higher resolution, the A7R IV has a higher resolution. We don't need that much of a resolution here, but it's really nice to see a bump up from the 24 megapixels of the A7 III. It does give you room to crop in while still retaining details, which I love. Because if you're a wedding photographer, an events photographer, or really anything, but specifically weddings and events, you know, sometimes I shoot a little bit wider because especially if I'm looking for specific moments, I'll grab the moment, I'll snap it, and then later I might just crop a touch to just reframe it, recompose it. And I love having that little bit of extra detail to be able to do it. We've also got a new processor here as well, so we're getting better details, especially in darker areas, which is great. 15 stops of dynamic range, which I think is probably what you'd expect. But there's some new interesting things here as well. 10 creative looks, which kind of apply an instant look to your photo. So if you want to shoot it just in JPEG, you don't want to do editing yourself in post, you can just pop those on and get some really interesting styles. Now, it's not something that really appeals to me personally because I like to shoot in RAW and then edit my photos, but I think that's a nice addition for someone who wants to shoot in JPEG and then just go straight out of camera. We've also got 10 frames a second, so no bump up there in speed from the A7 III, which I guess is fair enough. I mean, 10 frames a second is really not bad, to be honest. And actually here with the new processor, and we're also shooting with CF Express Type A, you're gonna see that there's no kind of stutter. There's no interruption as you go. So if you've ever used the A7 III, you've shot continuous, it'll go and it's really good, but then it'll sort of stop, stutter. We don't get that here, which I really like because that means if you're trying to capture a specific moment, you're not gonna get tripped up with something there, which is just, you know, defeats the point, right? So not having that interruption, that stutter, great. We've also got a buffer of 800 RAW plus JPEG, which is pretty decent, to be honest. Images look really great as well. Lovely colors, you know, nice and sharp. Now, to be fair, I'm using G Master lenses, so you would expect them to be nice and sharp, but really, really liking how this is coming out. So let's talk about autofocus. Now, obviously, if you know anything about Sony cameras, you know they just knock autofocus out of the park, and that's no different here. And you'd come to expect it, right? It'd almost be disappointing if it wasn't outstanding. So of course we've got eye, face tracking, real-time tracking for stills and for movie. We've got eye autofocus for humans, animals, and birds, which is a pretty big deal. We've not seen that before. And that's in stills and movie as well. It's also generally just faster, and I really did notice it. I shoot a lot on the A7 III, so switching back and forth between the A7 IV and the A7 III, I could really, really notice the difference between the speed of the autofocus. I've never thought the A7 III was slow, and I still don't think it's slow, but it was definitely noticeably slower than the A7 IV. The tracking is, of course, outstanding, as it always is. Here are some photos that we took of me running. We're using the 85mm f1.4 G Master lens because it feels like that's a tricky one to keep the focus. You know, it's a very shallow depth of field, so it's actually tracking me running towards the camera. I think it works extremely well. Here we have some video as well of Matilda moving around, again, same lens, so it picks up the eye, and as soon as that goes out of frame, like she turns around, for example, it'll try and go for the face. If it can't get that, it'll go for the whole body, track that, and then when the face and the eye are available again, it'll just take those again. Works seamlessly. It means you really never miss a shot, and certainly portrait and stuff like that, it just becomes very, very easy. Of course, you've got touch tracking as well for movies, so you just touch on the LCD screen, which I really like. That's going to allow you to track whatever you've selected. So if you touch on your subject, you can follow them around and just focus on them. So it takes a lot of that work out of it, especially if you want to use a gimbal or something like that. It's going to take a lot of the work out of follow focus and all that kind of stuff. There's also a new focus mapping mode that you can activate, so you can see on the screen which parts of the image are going to be in focus. Now, I know you're thinking, it sounds a little bit like focus peaking, but it is actually quite different, and it's quite useful to see a visual representation of what is and isn't in focus. Something which is quite impressive as well is the autofocus will work even at f22. And that might sound like, you know, why do you need that? Why would you be shooting at f22? And with autofocus as well, what are you shooting, wildlife at f22? Well, that's what I thought initially, but of course, teleconverters. Teleconverters absolutely play a massive role in sometimes having to shoot at some ridiculous f-stops, and including things like f22. So having the autofocus work at f22 is fantastic. And to prove the point, I took a photo of a swan at f22. I tracked it through some trees as well to make sure the autofocus was actually doing its job. And let me tell you, yes, I had to bump up that ISO, but the autofocus did absolutely work. So that's pretty impressive. Now, we've also got image stabilization, 5.5 stops of in-body image stabilization available to you, which I think is great. There's also an active mode, which means you can activate that if you want to go walking with the camera and stuff like that without using a gimbal. That's going to really help. This helps for handheld video. It helps for slower shutter speeds. I'm going to be a little bit critical here as well. Now, it's not bad at all, and I used it a lot, especially for handheld video. I shot almost entirely handheld video rather than on a gimbal, because you know what you're going to get with a gimbal, whereas it's interesting to see how is it going to perform with handheld video. Now, like I say, it's not bad. In fact, it's decent. It feels better than the A7 III as well, but it's just not the best I've ever used. And that is slightly noticeable, especially when shooting certain kinds of things, you know, walking, stuff like that. Yes, the active mode definitely helps, but it could be a touch better. Now, that's not to say that it's not super useful. It's still really great. I just think it could be a little bit better. It's one area, especially when you think about things like the autofocus is pretty much industry leading at this point. A lot of other things with these cameras are so good. I just wish the image stabilization was a touch better, but it's still decent. Now, speaking of handheld video, and of course, video in general, like I mentioned at the beginning, this is definitely a hybrid camera, right? It's designed for photography and very much for video. Now, of course, the A7S III is still going to be a professional video option. The A1 as well, obviously, offers a lot of professional video options, but this really has had a big step up from the A7 III. Now, I use the A7 III a lot for video, but the A7 IV would definitely be my upgrade. So let's run quickly through the video spec, and then we're going to pick up on some of them, because I know there's going to be a couple you're going to want to pick up on, because that's what I thought when I heard it. 4K, up to 30 frames a second. That's downsampled from 7K. That's full frame readout, and that looks fantastic. 422 10-bit. Really happy about that. The A7 III was stuck at 420 8-bit, so it's great. 422 10-bit. I love that, and the 4K looks fantastic. We've also got 4K 60p, which is great, but it is with a Super 35 mode, so essentially an APS-C crop. Now we're gonna come back to that in a second because we'll just talk about the other video spec before we talk about the crop, which I know is what we do want to talk about. Full HD up to 120 frames a second, so you got that super slow motion. I think that's decent. Maybe it could have been 240, maybe that would have been nice, but it's fine. I mean, I generally will shoot 120 or 60 for slow motion anyway, so I think that's fine. The 4K is also all intro, which is really nice. We've also got H.265 available, a max bitrate of 600 megabits a second. We've got S-Cinetone in there, as well as better S-Log3, and you can match this with the Cine cameras, so things like the FS6, the FX9, or even the A7S III. You could use this as a B cam for kind of any of those cameras. And we've got a new focus breathing assist mode, which pretty much eliminates focus breathing, which is really, really impressive. And in some circumstances, that's gonna be really useful. So let's talk about the one thing that stood out from all of that. 4K 60, yes, fantastic, but with the crop. I think we all would prefer that it didn't have the crop. I used that mode quite a lot because I wanted to test out how it felt. It did make certain things a little bit more difficult. It obviously immediately makes handheld video a little bit more difficult because you are more zoomed in now, which means that any shake is kind of amplified. So it's easier to actually get a smoother shot at 4K 24, 25 because it's a little bit wider and you've got a little bit more flexibility for moving. Whereas 4K 60, zoomed in, kind of amplifies that shake. So handheld video becomes a little bit harder with the crop. It's just one of those things that you would absolutely get used to. It's not the end of the world, but it is a bit of a shame that it's there. Now, you can turn it to your advantage, and this is something I've done in the past with crops like this, is that you can actually obviously get more reach out of your lens. So if you want to be able to zoom more, if you want to be able to capture something a little bit further away or just have a more zoomed look, this is the way to do that. That's actually a great thing to be able to do with this. So yes, you can't go as wide, but then yes, you can go even tighter than you were previously able to do. And then of course 4K, you could probably crop a little bit in post again. So you've got quite a lot of leeway there for getting further in. So it doesn't have to be a negative. It is a negative in some ways, in a lot of ways. I think we all would prefer it wasn't there, but you can turn it into an advantage if you want to, but that's gonna be personal preference, what kind of stuff you like to do. I'd love to hear whether you think that's a big deal though in the comments. Let me know if you think the crop is a big deal, because I can't work out whether that would really bother me or not. I think after a while I'd get used to it, and then I can shoot full HD 120 full frame. I can shoot 4K 24-25 full frame. So maybe it's just really not the end of the world. And to be honest, like I say, if you turn it to your advantage, actually it's not too bad. So let's talk about the design of this camera. Obviously it shares a huge amount in common with all the other Sony cameras. It shares the same kind of design and feel. It's an updated grip, more comfortable. It's super, super lightweight as well. You noticed at the beginning of this video, I really noticed when I took it out of the box. But the biggest things for me, vari-angle screen, which I love and I think is so good to have on the kind of basic model. It makes videoing yourself, like right now, for example, a million times easier. It makes just a lot of things easier, you know, composition, photography, loads of stuff. The flip out screen was kind of fine on the A7 III, but it is really annoying to not be able to move it around more. Now, being able to flip this all around is fantastic. We've got a new heat dissipating structure as well, so there should be no issues with overheating. Top panel record button, which I think is really nice. I actually really liked the placement of that. We've also got the digital audio interface for mics as well as the new menus actually in the camera, which I like. Now that's going to be kind of standard across the A7S III, the A1, the A7 IV. I like the new menus. They feel intuitive. If you've not used them, I'll just say they are definitely better than the old menus. We've got a new switch to switch between stills, movie, and S&Q. Now, when I first used this, I hated it, but after about 2 hours, I loved it. And now I absolutely love it, and I wish it was on my A7 III, and it's something that I think is really, really good. The reason I hated it, I think at first, was because it was so different to what I was used to with the A7 III, and I'm just, you know, change can be hard sometimes. But after, like I say, a couple of hours of shooting with it, that's all it took. And I was completely sold on this switch. It made going from photography to video, to then slow motion, to then 4K, and then back to photo, super easy, super quick, really intuitive. I really, really liked that. The viewfinder is nice and bright. It's a 3.69 million dot OLED viewfinder with a better resolution and better color. And it really is noticeable. It's one of those kind of viewfinders that you immediately can see that you've got a good shot just through the viewfinder. Of course, I mentioned that we have a vari-angle screen now. This is of course a touch operated screen, so you can touch for focusing, touch operation, which is really nice. And we have a lot of connections here as well. HDMI type A, microphone, headphone. We've got USB-C, which is super fast for transfer. We can also do charging. We can do connecting to Ethernet. We've got a much faster transfer over Wi-Fi as well. And something which is really interesting, which isn't really something I would use, but is a really nice thing to have available, is the touch tracking and the touch focus can be used through the mobile app. We've also got live streaming available via USB, which is super easy. Now, Sony told me about this, but I was reminded just how easy it is when I plugged my camera into the computer and it asked me, would you like to transfer your data, so your photos and your videos, or would you like to live stream? And you just select it on the camera and it's that easy. So overall, is this a worthy upgrade from the a7 III? Well, as an a7 III user, every day pretty much I use that camera, I can pretty confidently say, absolutely. I think this is a really big upgrade, a really, really good effort from Sony. Yeah, there's a couple of stumbling blocks. The crop with the 4K 60 is not ideal. The image stabilization, sure, it could be a little bit better. It's still decent, but it could be a little bit better. But otherwise, this has everything that I wanted from the a7 IV. Now, some people might have wanted 4K 120, but I think probably that is a bit unrealistic. I think it's in the a7S III, it's in the A1. It wasn't going to be in this camera. You know, I think the resolution bump is good without being some ridiculous resolution. I actually wouldn't want it to be any higher than megapixel count than 33 because the file size is going to get unwieldy past that, whereas this is a nice balance. I really like what Sony have done here. I'd love to hear your thoughts as well in the comments. Of course, check out the camera for yourself, link in description. Subscribe, like the video, all that kind of stuff if you enjoyed this. Any questions, pop them down in the comments. I will of course see you in the next video, and as always, thanks for watching.